Okay, back on video because of the recording. So what I'm saying is this is the first webinar in a series of webinars. We welcome you and hope to see you at many of these webinars. Um, and so obviously, as you've seen, the format is that we will introduce some videos for each webinar that are sort of like your homework to do before the webinar. And then in the webinar, we'll discuss these concepts and try to make it fun. And the goal of today's webinar is just an introduction to forecasting. So the concepts that are covered today will be revisited throughout the series. You're going to get a chance to apply some of these concepts as we go through different hazards, for example. Um, and our goal here is to be responsive to the questions that you sent us in the registration. And so we are trying to answer many of them today. Some of them were very advanced. And so the team has actually offered to try to reach out bilaterally to people with specific questions that we won't be able to answer today. Um, and it's wonderful to see all your weather forecasts come in. Thank you for sharing those. Please keep those coming. So at this point, what I'm going to do is start sharing a presentation on just the basics of forecasting as you continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. And um, what we're going to do today is have about 10 or 15 minutes of this PowerPoint. And I recognize that, in our fun homework videos, I was discussing forecasts with myself, of course, but some people learn better when they can see these things written out on a screen. So we will go through this PowerPoint briefly with some of the basics, recapping what we talked about in the videos. And then we're going to have more of a discussion. We're going to have a Q&A and a discussion among many very eminent forecasters and people working in anticipatory action, and hopefully answer your questions as well. So if you have questions, write them down, send them in the Q&A, and we do want to answer them. So yeah, looking forward to hear your questions. Great. So without further ado, let's start with a quiz. So this is a quiz about what was done in the pre-recorded videos. And so you can see in the videos, I was trying to have a good time while helping make some of these forecasting concepts memorable. And the goal here is to help introduce people to what these things mean and some of the ways that we approach weather forecasts. If you did not yet watch the videos, I do suggest watching them before the live webinar because we are trying to build on what was done in those videos. So Anita, I don't know if you can launch the quiz.
Okay, I think so. Can you see it?
I can't, but it's probably because I'm sharing my screen.
Ah, yes, it's up. The quiz is up.
Excellent.
We've got some thumbs up, yeah.
Perfect. All right, maybe I will stop sharing so that I can see. Oh, excellent, so that I can see what happens in the quiz. And you can,
Okay, so if you can't see it just yet, Erin, do you want me to
I've
read it
got
out?
it. Nope,
You've got
I've
it.
stopped sharing so I can see it.
Great.
Great. So the most popular answer so far, I'm going to give it away. Hopefully everyone has voted at this point. Most popular answer is the second answer in the quiz. 77% of people picked it. And the answer is a trigger is a forecast that exceeds a predetermined probability and magnitude, which activates action. There are more complicated definitions, but this is the basic baseline of the definition of a trigger. And the goal here, when we started introducing this terminology, the goal is to say when we get weather forecasts, there should be a point where everyone knows we need to take action. So specifying in advance, here is the type of forecast, and here's how bad the forecast would need to be to make sure that when we see that thing, we are all ready to go ahead and take action. And that's the basic idea of having a trigger at all, is that we don't want to receive a weather forecast and then get stuck in endless discussions about whether or not this is the right moment to act. What we've seen in human nature is that getting stuck in those endless discussions about whether or not this forecast is strong enough can cause delays that can be deadly. So the goal of a trigger is to simply pre-specify certain points at which we would be expected to act. And if there's a case where the trigger happens and people believe it is unnecessary to act, for example, um, for whatever reason, because of something that's happening in society or because they know that the forecast is wrong for some reason, then of course people could choose to not act on the trigger, but then they would have to justify this. And the whole point here is to try to encourage greater and more responsive action based on forecasts. So another piece of terminology that we discussed in the videos is a danger level. And you're going to see often in the world of anticipatory action that we talk about danger levels and we talk about impact levels. And the whole point there is to understand at what point does the event cause harm? How much water has what kind of impact, right? And of course, there's no single danger level, right? At one certain amount of water, you might get some impacts. At more water, you'll get more impacts, obviously. Um, but selecting some sort of danger level or impact level can help us understand the forecast itself, right? How much water is likely to cause a problem. And so here's a bit of a graphic from my colleague Juan Basso in Peru about how they selected some thresholds for danger levels to be used in anticipatory action for flooding on the Amazon River. And so you could see here they looked at flow rates on the Amazon and they started to compare this to the types of preparations that people have already done. So you can see here that houses are elevated because people are ready for a certain amount of flooding every year. And so the question was, looking at these more extreme levels of flooding that are very unusual, these are the kinds of things that would truly displace people from that region. And so these are the thresholds that they set as a danger level or an impact level to say when the forecast is saying that this kind of level is likely, we need to make sure we're taking action. Okay, more vocabulary recap. A return period. You saw that on the last slide. The x-axis in that plot was actually a return period. This vocab word, I think, is one of the most confusing, but very useful vocabulary in anticipatory action. And the return period simply means how often you can expect an event to happen on average. That is a messy concept because of the on average part. So if you have a 1 in 5 year return period, for example, that is an event that happens on average once every 5 years, which adds up to approximately twice in 10 years, approximately 4 times in 20 years, or approximately 20 times in 100 years. If everyone's following my math, you should see how I calculated that, if that makes sense. So because we're taking an average, a 100-year period is maybe the most useful. In 100 years, you're very likely to see 20 of these events. The problem with the concept of a return period is that the events are not equally spaced. So you have to think about it as having a random order. A storm that has a 1 in 5 year return period, oops, sorry about that, I didn't include the 5, um, would happen maybe 4 times in 20 years, right? We agreed on that in the last slide. Here we go, 4 times in 20 years. If you remember, trust me on this one. Then there are 20 years from the year 2000 to 2020. But you could have storms in random years, right? So you could have one location that had a few storms at the beginning of that period, some in the middle, and none at the end. Or you could have another location that had very few storms, then a whole bunch of storms, 15, 17, 19, 20. Um, and 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 that maybe would have confused people because they went from 2000 to 2015 with no storms and then had a bunch. Or another location that had storms in the year 2000, 2010, 2015, 2020, maybe more equally spaced out. So what you have to think about here is If you have a 1 in 5 year return period, you don't have 5 years of spacing in between the events. That is not how it works. You're just rolling a die, right? That has, let's imagine the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the die. How often are you going to roll a 5? Approximately once every 5 rolls. But you could roll a 5 twice in a row. And just rolling a 5 last time doesn't affect your probability of rolling it this time. So just watch out with return period because it's very useful. It tells us approximately how often we should expect a thing to happen, but it doesn't tell us when or in what order that thing will happen. You can also imagine the statistics of calculating what the return period is are very messy because of this problem. Here is an example of return period. So this is for my country. I live in the United States. And so our National Weather Service has calculated return periods of hurricanes along the coast. So here is how often, on average, different parts of the US would likely be hit by a hurricane. And you can see here in Florida, this is state here is called Florida, um, that places get hit, every 6 or 7 years by hurricanes. However, there was at one point, a number of years ago, what they called a hurricane drought. They had a big gap where Florida wasn't hit by a hurricane for, like, I don't know, a long time. But it still didn't change the return period. It was just a random accident that they had this blank period with not getting hit by a hurricane for a few years. And of course, you know, there were many hurricanes last year in the United States. Okay, next vocab word that we discussed in the videos is impact-based forecasting. Here is a definition for those of you who really like seeing things written out. And the idea here is to forecast the consequences of an event, not necessarily forecasting millimeters of rain, but forecasting who is going to be flooded or which roads are likely to be flooded. Or, for example, in the United Kingdom, there is an impact-based forecast available that shows that uses a wind forecast to forecast the probability of trucks, big lorries, blowing over, like overturning from the wind on any given road on any given day. So they'll issue this vehicle overturning forecast based on the wind forecast that helps truckers know where not to drive. So that is an impact-based forecast. They're translating the wind into impact in a way that's usable for the public. Obviously, you can imagine that I am very excited about impact-based forecasting. I think that we're seeing more and more growth of impact-based forecasting in the weather sector, and this is extremely useful for anticipatory action and our ability to take action. Great. So I'd like to just try an example with all of you. So one of the things we talk about a lot is a trigger. Here is an example, a fake example of a trigger. And I'd like to ask all of you to put in the chat. I'm going to ask you about the different components of a trigger, which I've indicated here in colors with parentheses. And credit for this goes to the German Red Cross, who designed this very cool exercise. So could I ask you to put in the chat, which of these things is the lead time? You can just put the color, or you could type the text, whatever is easier for you, depending on your color perception. I actually can't view what you type while I'm sharing my screen. So I will just listen. Anita, maybe you can kind of let me know when we've got a bunch of answers in there.
Everybody's writing yellow or orange.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Great. So that's the lead time. That is when we're expecting to do it. And what is the source of information? Where is the trigger coming from? Color, text, either is fine. Anita, maybe you can kind of tell me what's going on.
So we've got lots of reds.
Yep, great.
And PMD.
Excellent, perfect. What about the stop mechanism? That is a great an important part of a trigger. What is the stop mechanism in this case?
We
Anita?
have dark blue, lots of dark
Yeah,
blues in the
dark
chat.
blue.
Yep.
Excellent. Great. It's here if the forecast dropped below 38 degrees because they're starting to take action 5 days before, right? So they have a stop mechanism very clearly in here saying if the forecast changes, here's how we know what we're going to do. What about the probability? Obviously, this is obvious. I don't even know if you need to answer this because it literally says the word probability in here. It is light blue, but that is a crucial part of the trigger is to understand what is the probability of the event when you're taking action. And lastly, or no, I've got two more. Monitoring system is what color? You can see it here. Very
We've got
obvious.
a purple, lots of purples.
Great, lots of purple. And lastly, the threshold.
And we've got greens.
Excellent. Green. And I've got it written out for you here. These are components that are good to have, almost essential to have in what we would call a trigger statement. So in terms of the definition of a trigger, we talked about sort of the official definition, but this is really how it maps out. And this is what I would use as advice if you were trying to write down a trigger. People need to know who's monitoring what, where are we getting this information, what kind of lead time are we expecting, what is the threshold or the danger level or the impact level? What is the thing we're worried about that we're looking for? And what is the probability of that happening that we're expecting to see, that we're willing to act on, for example? If it was a 10% chance, maybe we wouldn't be willing to do our actions at that level of probability. And what's our stop mechanism? Because we recognize that, between the lead time and the event, there is quite a lot of time where things could change. All right. That's it for vocab. So that was our vocab lesson. And now I'd like to move us into a discussion with a number of other colleagues. And so the goal here is to have a conversation with a lot of different people, answer your questions, and also let you chime in and ask questions. So first, I would like to introduce Maureen Ambani. So Maureen is currently the regional coordinator for anticipatory action in East Africa for the World Food Program. But one of the reasons I think Maureen is a very important person to talk to is because she actually worked for the Kenya Meteorological Department before she moved over to the World Food Program. She actually also worked at the Red Cross briefly. So Maureen has worn both hats. She's been the forecaster and she's been the practitioner trying to use the forecast. And so, Maureen, I feel like you could also have these internal dialogues about how people can work together in your own head. And so, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to ask you to just kick us off. Do you have advice for people who are talking to forecasters? There was a guide that we shared about this where people can look for some advice as well. Was there anything that particularly resonates with you? Do you have thoughts and examples that you'd like to share? Over to you, Maureen.
All right. Thank you, Erin, and good morning, good afternoon to you all. Glad to have you on this webinar. In my hat juggling career, I've had to engage with people wanting to talk to forecasters, but then also me being in that forecasting seat, although at that time anticipatory action work was not as widely spread as it is right now. So one key advice I would say is that most of the time when people approach forecasters, they ask the question on what forecasts can you give me? But then a number of times the forecasters will actually turn around and ask you, what forecast do you need? And a lot of times people assume uh, that the person asking will already know what they need. or again, you also assume that the forecaster will just have some off-the-shelf something and then give it to you, and then you're good to go. But the reality is that it needs to be a conversation between you, articulating, first of all, what problem are you trying to address? Are you trying to address, for example, the fact that thousands of people will be affected by a flood in a particular area and their houses will get damaged? And when you explain that kind of issue you're trying to address, then it would be easy for a forecaster to try and help you figure out what forecast do you need. So for example, you won't just need a forecast of heavy rainfall, but you'll need forecast of a flood in a particular area that would likely affect that many people that you're interested to help. So I think one key advice is that approach it as it's going to be a conversation to understand what do you have and what do I need and how do we bring it all together in a way that works for both of us, which then relates to what the guide said. Know a little bit about what the Met Agency does and what information they have, what they can provide, because that will help you have a good conversation with them on what you need vis-a-vis what they can provide. And I was really quite amused by the questions that the guide said that do not ask these questions or avoid these questions, because a number of times you also go to the Met Agency and say, hey, I'd like to get all your data. But then they would ask you, what do you want to do with the data? Then you realize, okay, what I need the data for, I don't even have the expertise to analyze and develop that information. Rather, I should help them to understand what do I need. Like I need a flood forecast, and then they can turn that data to the kind of information that I need. Very last, and very important, it's important that as you're approaching the Met agencies, engage with their senior management, because then they will give you the support to sustainably get access to the kind of information you need. But then they can also designate a focal person for you from the Met agency who can help you to navigate engagement with Met services and be able to get the kind of information that you need. Back to you, Erin.
Great. Thank you, Maureen. It's also my pleasure to introduce my colleague Anita from the German Red Cross. Anita, do you want to introduce yourself and join in the conversation?
Yeah, so Maureen, what you said was really, really interesting. And I think we've come across that many, many times working with Met agencies, and realized actually, like what you said is so important, because you have to be clear on what you want. First of all, the data for, you have to always come back to the impacts, right? Because there's so many different forecasts for different impacts. So you just talked about like some impacts just now, but like it's a very different forecast when you're looking at impacts on crops, or impacts on livestock, or like impacts on drinking water quality. And so you need to be really clear on what impacts you want to address before you speak to the agency. And I also, I'm curious, like, do you, in your opinion, like if I'm totally new to forecasting, and I think many, 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 many people in the call are, and we read every single one of your questions. There were like more than 700 people registered and sent questions, and many, many, many of them were like just wanting to understand the basics of forecasting. So do you think that we need to understand like the science and the model, like what Erin showed earlier was like, I mean, I know when I was first started to work on anticipatory action, that made no sense to me. Do you think we need to understand the model and the science, or do you think that we can ask simpler questions? Like what kind of questions would you ask a forecaster to get them to translate like the science and the models into something that non-specialists can understand?
Yeah, that's a good question, Anita. Fortunately, you need to at least have some basics, because then otherwise you might get very lost when a forecaster starts to think about. One little secret to share with you, with Anita, is that when we are in school learning meteorology, they actually don't teach us how to talk to people who are not meteorologists. So it is a skill that we learn on the job
Oh my
and we
gosh, you
figure
should change the
out.
curriculum.
We should, right? And so I think it's something that people learn on the job, but at the end of the day is trying to find a balance between what you need and what the forecaster will tell you, right? But then for you to be able to communicate, you at least need to know some basics. So like the great job that Erin has just done to help us understand key terms can be a very good baseline to go to a forecaster and say, hey, I would like to take action based on a flood forecast in this area, but I don't want to take action all the time. I want to take action only when it's an extreme event. And then when you say that to them, then they'll be like, oh, okay. So maybe you need a 1 year, 1 in 5 year return period kind of flood forecast. Then of course you'd go like, what does that mean? Which goes back to what Erin was trying to help us to understand, which would help you to figure out, is that extreme enough for me to take action on? Or maybe I need to take action on when it's 1 in 10 year return period, depending on, again, the level of mandate and capacity that you have to take action on. So it's useful to know some basics because then you can have a meaningful conversation with the forecaster so that you can be able to get the information that you need.
Learn the lingo. So if anyone's already scared at this point in the webinar, like, oh my God, return period, oh, it's too much. Like, honestly, it's completely normal. I would say it took me a good year or so of just seeing the practical application and talking to forecasters and saying, yes, but what does that mean exactly? So don't worry, we'll revisit it in the second, third, fourth, and fifth webinars in the series, with different hazards, and we'll keep practicing and using those terms and explaining to you what we mean by return period, and we'll have people talking quite practically to explain how those terms are used and how to communicate with forecasters. So don't be scared. I'm going to, I have a question that came up quite frequently in the registration, and I'm going to ask Erin the question. So I understand, it was about situations of limited forecast data, right? So and generally in many of the countries we work in, limited data. So I understand that we need to look at old forecasts. You talked about look back in time and look at what happened in the past to try to assess together with climate change parameters, I guess, like how often they'll happen in the future so that we can plan better how often we might need to react. But what do we do with forecasters if we're in situations with really limited forecast data from the past?
I have found this to be one of the most challenging aspects of anticipatory action. When I first started doing anticipatory action, I came from the world of science and so I started talking to forecasters and scientists saying, okay, great, show me your historical forecast evaluations. And people that didn't have them. And I was so shocked. So I think that we've come up with a few different creative ways to manage this. One way of doing this is to look at reforecasts. So if your forecasting model didn't exist 20 years ago, you can actually take data from 20 years ago, run it through your model, and create a reforecast, essentially a hypothetical forecast of what would you have forecasted 20 years ago if your model had been in existence. So sometimes meteorological services do that already or are willing to do that when we ask them about the ability of their model. And so we can say, can you run reforecast to show us how would your model have performed in the past? Sometimes that's not possible. So sometimes then what we can do is try to find another model that does have reforecasts and look back at how that model performed in the past for past events to understand, did it do a good job? And then sort of compare your model to that model and say, look, I have for whatever reason, we have confidence that ours is better. Maybe for some recent events, we can show that ours is better. And the other one did well in the past. Therefore, we think we're going to use some combination of these, et cetera. And then another thing I've seen is just to try to be very case-based. So in places where you don't have good digital records, you can say, look, very basically, let's take Pakistan, for example. There have been two really devastating floods that I can remember made the media in the United States, where everyone was talking about flooding in Pakistan. Can we definitely look back at those events and just see what did the flood bulletins say? What did we know? What was knowable? What was known at those times? And so taking almost like a case approach to go back and look and see about how well models performed and try to piece it together to say what kind of forecast can we expect for the next big one, um, and go from there. One thing I will say, I'm just going to share one more slide that I made about this. Um, there is some more vocabulary related to forecast verification. And the slide, basically, my advice to those of you who are not scientists on this call is that if someone tells you they can forecast something, you need to say, prove it. Because forecasting is very difficult. And scientists can get very excited, including me, very excited when we can make some small forecasting advance. But if the scientist is saying, I've got this great forecast, you might not realize that they're excited about a very small advancement that is not as good at forecasting the thing you want as you think it is. And so you could ask, like, look, in the past, from 2000 to 2025, for example, how many times did your forecast that thing? How many were hits? You got it right. How many were misses? You didn't forecast the event, but it happened anyway. And how many were false alarms? You gave a forecast and there was no event. And this, I think, is the most basic way to interrogate a forecast, and that works very well and I think is reasonably explainable, that can then help us figure out which forecast can be used for which actions. Is this forecast the kind of forecast that could be used to evacuate people? Is it that good? Or is it something we want to do in a more general way? And so, Anita, can I actually ask you back? How do you plan for uncertainty? Given that any forecast is going to have hits and misses and false alarms, how do you manage that as a practitioner?
Well, I can say that we've learned a lot by failing forward, as we talk about it in the dialogue platforms. And we have whole documents on the hub about it in a series that the Climate Centre made, I believe, called Made Up Spill. So please check that out. So basically I don't think you need to understand the models, in detail. Like, you just need to be able to speak to the forecaster and ask the questions that you need to ask, like what are impacts, you're trying to address, and, what does that mean? So just like Maureen said, so for example, even if you have a very high level of certainty, like a 90% level of certainty that the forecast will be accurate, you can be quite sure that something will change, something in the environment, the immediate environment will go differently. It's just life, like if it's a river in forecast, maybe a dam is put up, and so on. So anyway, they just plan as much flexibility in as you can and communicate the uncertainty with all the stakeholders and the communities, and run scenarios and simulations around the different possibilities. So a miss. So, Erin, do you want to just explain once more what a miss is for everybody?
Yeah, sure. So miss is when you don't get a forecast, but the thing happens. So walking down the street, the heavens open and you get dumped on rain and you say, I had no warning. That is a miss.
Okay, so we know, like, forecasters will always give you that information. They'll always tell you the likelihood, if you ask the right question, that you'll miss it, you'll miss the event. And so what we try to do is we try to plan for it. I'm not saying all of our plans have them in that I've seen in the Anticipation Hub repository, but like our advice is plan for it. What happens if you get very, very short notice that a hazard is on the horizon, you can't implement your plan, it's a miss, if you like. What can you do in that event at short notice? Can you still do some basic early warning? Can you still implement some activities? And of course, you can always still start rolling out your post-shock response. And then another bit of lingo that we learned from you was false alarm. Maybe, Erin, you want to just explain once more false alarm?
Yeah, so false alarm is the other type of error where you were told that it was going to be a horrible, awful rainy storm, and you wear your fancy boots and umbrella and everything, and it's dry. Very obvious, false alarm. You take action, and later you believe that the action was unnecessary because the event didn't happen.
Great. So one thing that you can do is, we know that forecasts are less accurate the further away from the event it is, right? So, I mean, if anybody in the call, if you see a severe storm that's 20 days away, how likely are you to change your holiday? Not that likely, right? But you are likely perhaps to change your plans 5 days before the event because you know it's going to be more accurate. So one thing that you can do is you can put in what we call a stop mechanism. So you get completely ready, and then as close as possible to the event, you stop the action. And there can be a series of triggers. You might just have one trigger or two trigger or three triggers for action and different levels of action. So one thing that we see very often are like what we call lower regrets actions that are further away from the forecasted severe event. So maybe 15 days ahead of a forecasted flood, we might start clearing the drains so the drains don't block and flood the community. We might start looking at where all of the disabled people are and are they ready to evacuate. We might start looking at evacuation centres, and then we might have a second trigger closer to the time where we start taking more decisive actions, and then maybe even a third trigger, which is a few days, maybe 5 days before the event, where you start evacuating animals and people, which obviously has more consequences because people are reluctant to leave their homes. So we try to kind of like plan in according to these different trigger levels. And I don't know, Maureen, do you have any last advice on planning for uncertainty?
Yeah, thanks, Anita. And first of all, is that uncertainty in forecast is always going to be there, just because we are using models that don't perfectly represent reality, but they try to do as good a job as they can. So uncertainty is going to be there in forecast all the time. So we must get comfortable to learn to work and engage with uncertainty as much as possible. I'll give an example. It can also be mediated by the current context. So, for example, in 2022, it was part of the period where the Horn of Africa faced that prolonged and severe drought that lasted like, 3 years? And by 2022, we'd already had like 2 failed rainfall seasons in the region. So WFP Somalia got a forecast that says there's only about 20% chance, roughly, of the next season being below average. And while, again, it was representing like we are not very certain, but there is a chance of, the country office, WFP, still took action to mitigate the effects of a potential third failed rainfall season, because the understanding was if a third season happens, it's going to be really, really bad. So any chance there is that it's going to be another failed rainfall season, we better take action now, because then humanitarian needs will be much, much worse. So it was their way of managing the uncertainty in the forecast, but also mediating this with an understanding of where are we right now. Is there any chance that things could get worse? Maybe I should take action, because if this happens, things would be much, much worse, and it would be harder for me to handle. So part of it is also us understanding our risk appetite and the risk levels, and to what extent we have the capacity, the funding to be able to take action. Back to you, Anita.
Perfect. And that's another sort of term that we use a lot, like no regrets approach. You know, it's better to take action and not regret it later, perhaps. But that also depends a bit on the costs and the risks around those actions. And some actions are less risky than others, right? So evacuating livestock can be risky, but it's not so risky to clear drains, for example, ahead of a flood. That's super interesting. So I think like we had so many questions from the registration. So what we're going to do now for the next like 15 minutes or so is we're going to try to answer, like we grouped the questions, and where we saw a good 20, 30 questions that were on a similar theme, we grouped them, and we're going to try to answer some of them now. We also will answer them throughout the series. So stay tuned, and we'll try to revisit these themes and reinforce these topics and give practical examples, and keep your questions coming in the Q&A. So I want to bring in Ed to ask you one question that was asked many, many times in the registration. But first of all, Ed, would you like to introduce yourself? And thank you for coming today.
Thanks, Anita. Hi, everyone. My name is Ed Parkinson. I work at Start Network as a senior anticipatory action advisor. So I work with our national and international NGO members to do anticipatory action.
So, Ed, we were asked a lot of questions about anticipatory action and early warning systems and like how they connect, right? So, for example, one question was, how can anticipatory action be incorporated into early warning systems to help reduce damage? And another question, what is the difference between forecasting, early warning, and anticipatory action? There were many, many questions that were quite similar to that. So hopefully you'll answer a good 20, 30 people's questions, I think, if you can help us with that one.
I'll try my best, Anita. I think anticipatory action is really the logical conclusion of early warning systems. When we know what the weather is likely to do, what that disaster is coming or likely, and we know perhaps what the likely impacts are going to be, as Erin was describing, then it makes sense to take action to reduce those impacts where we can and how we can. And a crucial part of that with linking early warning systems to anticipatory action is leveraging humanitarian funds to be able to do that. So, triggering funds at a return period that is appropriate and warranted for that financing, and taking that action. So to give you an example, Start Network members in Bangladesh last year, their early warning system told them that there was flooding likely to occur. So they drew down funds from Start Network's humanitarian anticipatory financing funds, and they took actions to reduce impacts, damage for communities. For example, early warning messaging on what the flooding was likely to do for those communities that were at risk, evacuation of livestock so that they were safe and protected, distribution of waterproof items to protect kind of important documents and other essentials. So that's the real way that anticipatory action can be linked to early warning. In terms of the differences between these things, I think there's been some of this covered already, but a forecast, that's really the statement of what's likely to occur, the prediction, the estimate of that future event. So when we're talking about weather, we're talking about those forecasts that we might see on the news or on our weather app, often from a meteorological department or specialist provider of what the weather's going to be. When we're talking about early warning systems, we're shifting from what the weather's going to be to what's the weather going to do. So impact-based, as Erin and others were talking about, it's important to understand it from a perspective for us of what's the disaster impact, what's the predicted impact for at-risk communities, and that's ideally what an early warning system should do based on those forecasts. And then anticipatory action, as I said, it's that kind of application by humanitarian practitioners in a real world environment. So taking those forecasts, understanding what impacts are likely to be, and taking the action to kind of prevent or mitigate what those impacts are going to be for the populations that are facing a disaster around the corner. So I hope that answers your questions, Erin, and people those 20, 30 people are understanding a bit more.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Ed, for that. I think now it's time for Anita to answer a question that was raised quite a bit by the people who registered. And there's this concept of preparedness. And the question is, where does preparedness stop and anticipatory action begin? Are they related terms, Anita?
Well, this now is humanitarian lingo, right? Like we get very caught up on definitions and lingo, and of course we do a lot of preparedness for anticipatory action, don't we? But in terms of using the lingo, using the terminology, so anticipatory action begins with a prediction or a forecast. That's the main thing, and preparedness can happen at any time, right? So the difference is with AA that you take action before the forecasted impacts. I mean, of course, you prepare for that, but in classic like humanitarian lingo terminology, preparedness can mean just to get ready to act after a hazard. So just to be really certain of what we're talking about and when the action takes place, we use the terms anticipatory action because it needs to take place before the forecasted impacts of a hazard. So, for example, like preparedness can mean, ambulances on standby to respond after a cyclone. That's an example of preparedness. Whereas AA, you would actually take actions to prevent and reduce harm before then, like the example I gave, like a community cleanup of large items that could fly at 100-kilometer-hour winds and harm people. So that's actually the actions are implemented, before the peak of the impacts and sometimes the hazard. I hope that answers that question. So I want to call another new face. I want to call Madhab. Are you there with us, Madhab? Do you see, is Madhab in the call? He's here. Hi, Madhab. So I'd like you to introduce yourself and answer a question that came up quite often about data scarcity, right? So if you could answer a question, because many of the countries that we work in, there's like a huge amount of data scarcity. So could you answer the question on what do we do when we don't have much historical data on impacts? When is it not readily available?
Thank you, Anita. So yeah, this is Madhav Upeti. So can you hear me? Yes.
I found
So
him.
yes. Oh, we have someone unmuted. So
Hello.
Yeah. So I'm also the colleague of Erin. So I work for Red Cross Red.
Now you have to unmute yourself, Madhab.
Oh, sorry. I work for Red Cross and Climate Center. Yeah, colleague of Erin. So coming back to your question, Anita, I think that's a common challenge we have been facing, particularly when it comes to the historical impact data. I think it's important. And sometimes what happens is like, yes, we do not readily get those data, but even if we get those data also, those are not to the quality that we would like to have. So I think the important thing is to first kind of get back to the fundamental question of why those data are required, right? So one is obviously, yes, we need to understand the impact of any hazard, because that's where this whole concept of A is grounded. Because we need to know like which impacts we're going to address and is really feasible to do. But at the same time, I think the importance of impact data is more on the defining the danger level, those impact level, which Erin was earlier mentioning, because we need to know like at which point, at which trigger point that we need to act, right? Where we see the impact or the humanitarian consequences would be concerning. And this is where I think, yeah, it's become difficult when we don't have a data, particularly the impact database, like looking at like what were the events in the past and what were the impacts, particularly on the people's lives, maybe livelihoods, different infrastructure. So if we had those database as such, yeah, things becomes a bit easier. But if not, yes, it will be challenging, but definitely not possible, like not impossible, because there are different ways to look into it. I think the important thing is we need to like try to get whatever we can. So maybe we may not get a kind of the data that we would like to have, or the quality as such, or the specificity of it. But we need to see like what better we can get in the given context. And we have seen like in different like the work within the Red Cross also, like when there are not these data like readily available, like we went on investigating some of these different sources like social media posts in the past, or the newspaper articles as well, and even some research papers like where we start to kind of gather, okay, what was the different kind of the impacts that particular hazard has caused in the past, because that will give us a bit of indication not only on the type of the impacts, but also maybe some indication around our danger level, like, okay, what could be those hazard level that we might put as our kind of the danger level for the trigger point. So that is one way. And sometimes, like if you are really implementing, trying to implement the anticipatory action at the really community level, like at really small scale, then you may want to run like a quick impact survey as well at the community level. Like and this doesn't have to be like that much resource intensive. You might be doing a lot of assessment already at the community level, like it's just trying to investigate a bit further, like, okay, what was the impacts of the different hazards in that community in the past, like what, like for example, what flood level was more concerning that they need to evacuate in the past, or what was the storm winds that they thought maybe their houses would be damaged. So these kind of fundamental questions, like if that is integrated within our assessment, whenever we are trying to do a lot of these community programs as well, will give us quite a bit of details, or quite a bit of those context that can help in terms of defining out those danger level thresholds, are really kind of setting up the system. So yeah, so definitely the road to the A would be a bit bumpy if we don't have these historical data readily available, but I would say it's not impossible. So we should be trying to get whatever we can from these resources. So that's all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Madhav. That was such a great answer. And I remember in one of the first times I ever worked on anticipatory action, we used newspaper articles in Uganda to try to understand historical impacts and link that with historical forecasts, which was very cool. I'd like to ask a quick question. I know we're running out of time, but I really do want to highlight Dr. Gigma Kiswansita. Gigma, I don't know if you mind taking your coming on camera. He has been answering all your questions in the chat, so we're super grateful that Gigma, you've been able to do this. Thank you so much. Could you just give us, this question came in via the registration, so we're going to ask you this one. What is a sub-seasonal forecast, and can we use those?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. First of all, I'm not making anything complicated, but just to say that we often are used to, let's say, two scales of forecasting: weather forecast and seasonal forecast. The weather forecasts are basically what says us what will happen in the next few days. Tomorrow is going to be shiny, it's going to be raining, next week it's going to be X, Y, Z, etc. Versus forecasts that give us an indication of how the next season will be. Those in Europe, for example, are already worrying. How will this summer be? Is it going to be as hot as, I don't know, a few years ago? Is it going to be cooler, etc.? But then in between the two, we also need some information. And this is exactly what sub-seasonal forecast information is a forecast information that has a range from approximately 2 weeks to 2 months that give us an indication of what the conditions will be over that period of time. Of course, it is a very useful information. Why? First of all, there are some hazards that are very relevant at the sub-seasonal scale. When we take a hazard such as dry spells are a hazard that occur during the rainy season, during a couple of weeks or a couple of days. It doesn't rain, and depending on when exactly it occurs, it may have impacts that are similar to drought, but it's exactly not the same as drought. So having a subseasonal forecast information, for example, allows us to plan for how to act ahead of this dry spell. And in addition, I think at the beginning of this session, we're discussing a bit about preparedness, readiness, etc. Of course, in order to be able to take early actions, it is important to also have a better understanding of the timing of hazards. And subseasonal forecast information is exactly what we need to this effect. And of course, it is used in combination of seasonal and weather forecast. Let's say at the beginning or right before the season, you say that this particular year is going to be, let's say, wetter than usual. This doesn't give an indication as to when exactly during the season we're going to have extra rainfall. But then a subseasonal forecast information released at the beginning of the month can say that towards the last week of the month, we are going to expect, let's say, wetter than usual conditions. And then this will already give the humanitarian organization, for example, a window as to where they should focus more their efforts. And last, the weather information will come to say that this particular day is where, let's say, a heavy rainfall is going to occur. So it is an information, subseasonal forecast information is an information that complements, let's say, seasonal and weather information, and it also allows us to have more readiness and more preparedness. Sorry if I've taken too long.
No, that's great. Anita, do you want to say some closing words? Because then I think we're going to transition to the after party. We've hit our time. Go ahead, Anita.
Right, exactly. If you could get the slides back up again, I'm just going to try to answer, I think, maybe about 70 or 80 questions linked to some resources that are needed. And I thought maybe I'll just go over a bit of what we have on the Anticipation Hub. And please feel free to put in the chat if you guys have any more resources that I might have that might be useful. We will share the links to everything that I'm about to describe in the email that you'll all receive after the webinar, and I'll also paste the links in the chat. So I'll quickly do that, and then we'll move to the after party where we'll switch off the microphones and people can answer questions that came up in the Q&A, or you can unmute your mics and ask different questions. For example, we'll probably ask Maureen more about impact levels and defining impact levels and why different agencies have different impact levels. We'll do that all afterwards, but just to wrap up, to let people go that need to go now. So resources that you can find on the Anticipation Hub. So we have a database with a global map, and in it you will be able to click on different countries and see basically who's doing what in that country. And most of them also have contacts, people that you can get in contact with. So hopefully that will help some of you if you're starting off in anticipatory action. A lot of you asked specifically about anticipatory action for different topics, so for example, anticipatory action and conflict, or epidemics, cholera. Like a lot of people asked about community-led anticipatory action, which we'll explore. Those topics we'll explore more in the 5th session. So we have on the hub a whole bunch of working groups that are focused on these specific topics. So we have working groups, for example, on working on AA in conflict, epidemics, health, and AA, locally led working group, and so on. And also you will find working groups by region and sub-region where you can connect with people in that region and ask for support. So yeah, the rule of thumb is don't start from zero. There's almost always somebody that's already working on a hazard or starting to work on a hazard that you can learn from. And we also have some databases that might be useful for you. Like if you want to look up examples of triggers, we have a trigger database. Actions, if you're particularly interested in anticipatory cash or a specific working with livestock, then you can filter in that anticipatory action database, by hazard and by action and by country. And we also have an evidence database. A lot of you asked about evidence, in which we've selected the more robust evidence that has been published on anticipatory action. And please also let us know if you have evidence to add to that. Also, make use of the community directory, in which I think there's over 80 experts have put in their contact details, and you can contact them because they have expertise in a specific country or a specific topic, and add yourselves to that. And very, very useful is we have a global overview report that comes out each year. So you can access the 2023 global overview report, which is still incredibly useful. It gives a list of the recent evidence, trends, and so on. And there are 3 Excel spreadsheets that you can download and sort by country, by hazard. And in that, you will find the anticipatory action frameworks in each country that are also being developed or have been activated. And the new report for 2024 should come out in the next few weeks as well. So if you've signed up to the Anticipation Hub newsletter, you'll know about that. You'll get that information in your inboxes. And lastly, next slide, dialogue platforms. Again, if you sign up to the Anticipation Hub newsletter, you potentially can join some dialogue platforms which are in person or sometimes hybrid. Erin, do you think you could change the slide to the next slide? So in the dialogue platforms, you will see there's a huge number of practitioners. They come together, they talk about different themes and topics. And yes, Erin, are you able to change the next slide, to turn the next slide? For the dialogue platforms, does it turn?
This is what, oh, you're not seeing me change it. You don't see it where it says dialogue platforms 2025?
No, but maybe it's just me. Never mind. Everybody will receive that in their inboxes. So don't worry. So anyway, we'll send you the PowerPoint. We'll send you all the links that have been shared today and links to everything that I talked about just now. Hopefully that covers a lot of your questions, but if you have more, keep them coming. And back over to you, Erin. So Erin's frozen. So while she's frozen, what she would update you on now is that on Friday, you should receive in your inboxes videos for the next topic, which is on floods. So we're looking forward to that. The week after that, we'll be looking at cyclone, and the session 4 will be looking at heat wave and cold wave, and the last session will be looking at some of these other non-weather related hazards. So that's all from us for now. We have some Q&A if you want to hang on and take a look at the answers that have been written. If you want to now unmute your mics and ask some of the questions that you've been burning to answer, you'll be really, really welcome. And before you go, I'd really, really appreciate it if you would answer a small two-question evaluation that I'm going to put in the chat, but we'll also send it by email. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Unfortunately, it looks like we lost Erin for a second. So thank you so much, everybody. So now, if anybody wants to stay on optionally for another 20 minutes until 3 o'clock CET, you're more than welcome to stay, and then we can have more of a off microphone, off recording discussion. So thank you for everybody that needs to leave now. Thank you so much. And for the rest of you that would like to remain and chat, we'll stop the recording now. Thank you.